The temperature was minus 37 degrees Celsius that morning in February 1953, when Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Volkov first heard the voice speaking perfect Russian through the static of his monitoring station near Magadan. What made his blood freeze wasn't the words themselves, but the fact that, according to his equipment, the transmission was coming from coordinates that placed the source somewhere in the middle of the Sea of Okhotsk, 200 kilometers from the nearest landmass. The voice was reading what sounded like meteorological data, but the numbers didn't match any weather patterns Volkov had ever encountered in his 7 years of Arctic service. This incident, buried in classified reports for decades, would become the first documented case of what Soviet radio operators in the Far East began calling phantom broadcasts, transmissions that appeared to originate from impossible locations, carrying information that shouldn't exist and speaking in voices that belonged to no known personnel. The phenomenon would haunt the airwaves of the Soviet Far East for nearly 4 decades, creating a subculture of fear, speculation, and underground investigation among those who worked the loneliest radio posts in the world. The story begins not with ghosts or supernatural explanations, but with the harsh realities of Cold War electronics warfare. In 1948, the Soviet Union launched what would become the most comprehensive radio jamming operation in history. The goal was simple: prevent Western propaganda from reaching Soviet citizens and deny enemy intelligence services the ability to communicate with assets inside Soviet territory. What emerged was anything but simple. The scale of the Soviet jamming network was staggering. By 1952, over 5,000 high-powered transmitters stretched across the USSR, from the Baltic coast to the Chukchi Peninsula. The power requirements were enormous. The jamming stations consumed roughly 12% of the Soviet Union's total electrical output during peak operation hours. In the Far East alone, 47 major installations pumped out millions of watts of white noise, creating an electronic curtain that could be detected as far away as Australia. But something strange began happening in the remote monitoring stations scattered across Siberia and the Soviet Far East. Radio operators, many of them young conscripts serving mandatory terms in some of the most isolated locations on Earth, started reporting anomalies that didn't fit the standard patterns of jamming interference. These weren't the familiar squeals and static bursts generated by the official jamming equipment. These were coherent signals that seemed to emerge from the noise itself. Lieutenant Colonel Alexei Borodaikin, commander of Radio Installation 47 near Anadyr, kept detailed logs of these incidents. His classified reports, declassified only in 1998, paint a picture of growing unease among his personnel. In June 1954, 3 different operators on 3 different shifts reported hearing the same female voice reading numbers in what sounded like code. The voice always appeared around 2:15 in the morning local time, lasted exactly 11 minutes, and vanished without any change in the background static levels. What made Borodaikin's reports particularly disturbing was his methodical approach to investigation. He personally monitored the frequencies during the reported times and confirmed the phenomenon. More troubling still, he discovered that the voice was transmitting on frequencies that were supposed to be completely blocked by the installation's own jamming equipment. It was as if the signal was somehow riding inside the jamming transmission itself, using the very electronic noise meant to prevent communication as its carrier wave. The phenomenon wasn't limited to voice transmissions. Operators across the Far East began documenting what they called ghost music, fragments of orchestral pieces, folk songs, and even what sounded like radio dramas that would fade in and out of the static like distant memories. Petty Officer Second Class Viktor Suslov, stationed at a monitoring post on Wrangel Island, reported hearing what he swore was a complete performance of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, transmitted over 17 consecutive nights in October 1955. Each night, the music would begin at exactly 9:37 p.m. and continue for precisely 2 hours and 23 minutes. The military's initial response was predictably bureaucratic. Reports were filed, investigations were launched, and equipment was tested and retested. The official explanation was that atmospheric conditions in the Arctic were creating unusual propagation effects. causing distant legitimate broadcasts to appear as if they were originating from impossible locations. Solar activity was blamed, equipment malfunction was suggested, mass hallucination was seriously considered. But the reports kept coming, and they were becoming more specific and more disturbing. In December 1956, multiple stations reported receiving what appeared to be radio communications between Soviet military units that didn't exist. The transmissions used proper call signs and authentication codes, discussed operations and personnel transfers, and followed standard military radio protocol in every detail. The problem was that when headquarters attempted to verify these communications, they discovered that the units mentioned in the transmissions had never been formed, the operations discussed had never been planned, and the personnel names being mentioned belonged to soldiers who had died years earlier in the Great Patriotic War. Senior radio operator Elena Vassilievna, one of the few women assigned to Far East monitoring duty, documented the most chilling incident of this period. On January 13, 1957, she intercepted what appeared to be a standard supply request from a unit identifying itself as the 42nd Arctic Reconnaissance Battalion. The transmission was crystal clear, following proper format, and even included the correct authentication codes for that date. Vassilievna dutifully forwarded the message to Regional Command for processing. The response came back within hours. The 42nd Arctic Reconnaissance Battalion had been completely wiped out during the German offensive at Stalingrad in 1942. Every member of the unit was confirmed killed in action. The authentication codes being used in the transmission were the actual codes assigned to that unit 15 years earlier, codes that were sealed in classified archives and known only to a handful of surviving staff officers. This incident marked a turning point in how Soviet authorities approached the phantom broadcast phenomenon. What had been dismissed as atmospheric anomalies or equipment malfunction was now being treated as a potential security breach of the highest order. If someone or something was accessing classified military codes from decades past and using them to generate fake transmissions, the implications for national security were enormous. A special investigation team was assembled under the joint authority of the GRU and the KGB, with orders to determine the source of these transmissions by any means necessary. The team included signal intelligence specialists, atmospheric scientists, electronics engineers, and, perhaps most tellingly, a psychiatrist specializing in what Soviet science euphemistically called perception anomalies under extreme environmental stress. The investigation team's findings, classified at the time and only partially released after the fall of the Soviet Union, make for fascinating reading. After 18 months of intensive investigation, they concluded that the phantom broadcasts were real, verifiable transmissions that could be recorded, analyzed, and traced. They were not hallucinations, equipment malfunctions, or atmospheric anomalies. They were genuine radio signals appearing on Soviet monitoring equipment. What the team couldn't determine was their source. The triangulation data made no sense. Signals appeared to be originating from empty ocean, uninhabited wilderness, or in some cases, from coordinates that placed them several kilometers underground. The technical analysis was equally baffling. The signals showed characteristics of both very modern and very primitive radio equipment, sometimes simultaneously. Power levels fluctuated wildly, without any corresponding changes in signal strength. Most disturbing of all, some transmissions appeared to be arriving at their destinations before they were sent, based on careful timing analysis of multiple monitoring stations. But perhaps the investigation team's most significant discovery was that the phantom broadcasts seemed to be increasing in frequency and complexity as the Soviet jamming network expanded. The correlation was too strong to be coincidental. The more powerful the jamming transmissions became, the more phantom signals appeared within them. It was as if the jamming network wasn't just blocking unwanted communications, it was somehow generating new ones. The investigation team's conclusions reached Moscow in spring 1958, just as the phenomenon they were studying began to evolve in ways that would challenge everything the Soviet military thought it understood about electronic warfare. What had started as isolated reports of phantom voices reading weather data and military communications was becoming something far more complex and unsettling. The broadcasts were developing what could only be described as personality. Senior Lieutenant Boris Fedorov was manning the night shift at Radio Installation 63 near Providenia when he became the first operator to document what the classified reports would later call interactive phenomena. It was March 21st, 1958, 3:17 a.m. local time, when Fedorov heard a familiar female voice emerge from the static on frequency 14.7 megahertz. This was the same voice that operators across the Far East had been reporting for months, always reading numbers, always lasting exactly 11 minutes, always vanishing without explanation. But this time was different. As Fedorov listened to the routine recitation of meteorological coordinates that made no geographic sense, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Following standard protocol for unidentified transmissions, he keyed his microphone and transmitted the required challenge. Unidentified station, you are transmitting on a restricted frequency. Identify yourself immediately or cease transmission. What happened next defied every principle of radio propagation that Fedorov had learned in his 3 years of military communications training. The phantom voice stopped mid-sentence. There was a pause of exactly 7 seconds. Fedorov timed it, and then the voice resumed, but instead of continuing with the weather data, it began reading Fedorov's military service record, including his hometown of Tula, his mother's maiden name, and his assignment history going back to his initial training at the Leningrad Military Communications Academy. The voice knew things about Fedorov that weren't in any file, shouldn't have been in any file. It mentioned his childhood fear of thunderstorms, the scar on his left hand from a kitchen accident when he was 12, and the fact that he had been thinking about his girlfriend Katya just moments before the transmission began. Then, as if this breach of impossible intimacy wasn't disturbing enough, the voice politely thanked him for his challenge and resumed reading the meaningless weather coordinates as if nothing had happened. Fedorov's report triggered an immediate and unprecedented response from Soviet military intelligence. Within 72 hours, a team of specialists from both the GRU and KGB descended on Installation 63, equipped with recording devices, spectrum analyzers, and what the classified inventory lists described simply as special psychological evaluation equipment. The specialists spent 2 weeks attempting to recreate Fedorov's experience, broadcasting challenges on every frequency where phantom transmissions had been reported. They got answers. Not the kind of answers they were hoping for, but answers nonetheless. The phantom voices began responding to their challenges with information that was equally impossible and equally intimate. They recited personal details about the investigators, details about their families, details about classified operations that were known only to a handful of senior officers in Moscow. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to know what the investigators were thinking, often commenting on unspoken doubts or fears with an accuracy that suggested some form of direct mental contact. But the responses weren't limited to personal information. The phantom voices began providing intelligence data that proved to be remarkably accurate. They reported the positions of American submarines in the Pacific with precision that exceeded anything Soviet naval intelligence was obtaining through conventional means. They described weather patterns that wouldn't manifest for weeks but turned out to be completely accurate when they finally occurred. They even provided early warnings of equipment failures at other Soviet installations, warnings that allowed maintenance crews to prevent potentially catastrophic breakdowns. This intelligence windfall created a profound dilemma for Soviet military leadership. The phantom broadcasts were clearly a security breach of unprecedented proportions. Something or someone was accessing their most classified information and displaying knowledge of their personnel that should have been impossible to obtain. But at the same time, the information being provided was proving to be incredibly valuable for Soviet operations in the Pacific. Colonel General Ivan Serov, who was heading the KGB at the time, made the controversial decision to begin systematically exploiting the phantom broadcasts while simultaneously investigating their source. A special unit was established within the KGB's 16th Directorate, tasked with monitoring all phantom broadcast frequencies and compiling the intelligence data being provided. The unit was given the cover designation Special Communications Analysis Group and was staffed with a unique combination of signals intelligence specialists, psychologists, and what Soviet science called parapsychological researchers. The intelligence being gathered through this program was extraordinary. The phantom voices provided advance warning of American nuclear submarine movements in the Pacific, allowing Soviet naval forces to position themselves for optimal surveillance. They reported on internal American military communications that Soviet intelligence had been unable to penetrate through conventional means. They even provided insights into American strategic planning that proved accurate months or sometimes years later. But perhaps the most valuable intelligence came in the form of technological information. The phantom voices began describing American radar systems, communication protocols, and electronic warfare capabilities with a level of technical detail that suggested direct access to American military engineering documents. This information allowed Soviet engineers to develop countermeasures for American systems that wouldn't be officially revealed for years. The success of the intelligence program created its own problems. Word of the phantom broadcasts began spreading through Soviet military and intelligence circles despite strict security classifications. Officers who weren't directly involved in the program began requesting access to the intelligence being gathered. Some began attempting to establish their own contact with the phantom voices, often with disturbing results. Major Alexei Kuznetsov, commanding officer of a radar installation on the Kamchatka Peninsula, decided in October 1958 to begin his own phantom broadcast monitoring program. Kuznetsov had heard rumors about the intelligence being gathered from these mysterious transmissions and believed his strategic location near American Aleutian bases would make his installation particularly valuable for such work. Kuznetsov's first attempts at contact seemed successful. He quickly established communication with a phantom voice that identified itself using the call sign Arctic Whisper and began providing detailed information about American military activities in the Aleutian Islands. The intelligence was so accurate and so immediately useful that Kuznetsov's installation was credited with preventing 3 different American reconnaissance intrusions into Soviet airspace. But after 6 weeks of successful contact, Arctic Whisper began making requests. Small things at first, asking Kuznetsov to adjust his monitoring schedule, requesting that certain frequencies be left clear during specific time periods, suggesting modifications to his antenna configurations. Kuznetsov complied with these requests, reasoning that maintaining good communication with such a valuable intelligence source was worth minor operational adjustments. The requests gradually became more significant. Arctic Whisper began asking for access to classified Soviet radar frequencies, requesting copies of operational orders from Kuznetsov's superiors, and eventually demanding that Kuznetsov provide detailed information about Soviet defensive positions throughout the Kamchatka Peninsula. When Kuznetsov finally realized he was being manipulated and attempted to break contact, Arctic Whisper's response was swift and devastating. Every piece of electronic equipment at Kuznetsov's installation began malfunctioning simultaneously. Radar sets that had operated flawlessly for years suddenly displayed false targets and phantom aircraft. Radio transmitters burned out their vacuum tubes within hours of replacement. Even simple electronics like electric clocks and battery-powered devices stopped working properly. The base's power generators experienced cascading failures that couldn't be explained by any known mechanical or electrical principles. Most disturbing of all, the phantom broadcasts targeting Kuznetsov's installation became actively hostile. Instead of providing intelligence, Arctic Whisper began broadcasting detailed information about Soviet military positions to any frequency that American forces might be monitoring. The phantom voice revealed classified operational plans, described defensive weaknesses, and even provided American forces with real-time updates on Soviet troop movements in the region. The Kuznetsov incident forced Soviet authorities to radically reassess their approach to the phantom broadcast phenomenon. What had initially appeared to be an intelligence windfall was clearly something far more complex and potentially dangerous. The phantom voices weren't just passive sources of information. They were active entities capable of sophisticated manipulation and apparently possessing their own agendas. A new investigation was launched under the joint authority of the GRU's 6th Directorate and the KGB's 16th Directorate, with orders to determine not just the source of the phantom broadcasts, but their purpose and the extent of their capabilities. The investigation team included electronic warfare specialists, counterintelligence officers, communications engineers, and, for the first time in Soviet intelligence history, specialists in what was euphemistically called anomalous phenomena research. This team's findings, classified at the time under the highest levels of Soviet state security, revealed that the phantom broadcast phenomenon extended far beyond simple radio transmissions. The voices weren't just accessing Soviet communications networks. They were somehow interfacing directly with Soviet personnel, extracting information through methods that appeared to bypass normal sensory channels and even conscious awareness. The team documented cases where phantom voices demonstrated knowledge of events that hadn't happened yet, conversations that hadn't taken place, and decisions that hadn't been made. They found evidence that the phantom broadcasts were somehow accessing Soviet personnel's memories, thoughts, and even dreams. Most disturbing of all, they discovered that prolonged exposure to the phantom broadcasts appeared to create permanent changes in the affected personnel's psychological and neurological functioning. Radio operators who had been exposed to phantom broadcasts for extended periods began displaying enhanced intuitive abilities, reporting that they could somehow sense the content of radio transmissions before they were received. They developed an uncanny ability to predict equipment failures, atmospheric disturbances, and even personnel rotations. But these enhancements came at a cost. The affected operators also began experiencing severe psychological symptoms, including chronic insomnia, auditory hallucinations when away from their equipment, and an obsessive compulsion to monitor radio frequencies even during off-duty hours. The investigation team's final report, completed in spring 1959, contained recommendations that would fundamentally alter Soviet approach to radio operations in the Far East. The phantom broadcasts, the team concluded, represented a phenomenon that was beyond the current understanding of Soviet science and potentially beyond the control of Soviet technology. The recommendation was made to gradually reduce dependence on the intelligence being provided while implementing strict protocols to limit personnel exposure to the phantom broadcast frequencies. But by then, it was already too late. The phantom broadcasts had become an integral part of Soviet intelligence operations in the Pacific, and the military leadership was reluctant to abandon such a valuable intelligence source. The decision was made to continue the program under enhanced security protocols while simultaneously developing countermeasures against potential hostile manipulation. This decision would prove to be one of the most fateful choices made by Soviet intelligence during the Cold War. The phantom broadcasts weren't just an intelligence source or a security breach. They were something far more fundamental and far more dangerous. And as Soviet operators continued to interact with these mysterious voices emerging from the static, the phenomenon began to evolve in ways that would challenge the very foundations of Soviet understanding about the nature of communication, consciousness, and reality itself. The winter of 1959 brought changes to the Far East that would reshape Soviet understanding of the phantom broadcast phenomenon. As temperatures plummeted to -42°C across the region, something fundamental shifted in the nature of the mysterious transmissions. The voices that had been content to provide intelligence and engage in limited interaction began displaying capabilities that challenged every assumption Soviet scientists had made about the nature of reality itself. It was Senior Lieutenant Yuri Petrov at Radio Installation 78 near Magadan who first documented what the classified reports would later call temporal displacement phenomena. Petrov had been monitoring phantom broadcast frequency 12.3 MHz for over 18 months, establishing regular contact with an entity that identified itself as Northern Light 7. The conversations had become routine. Northern Light 7 would provide weather forecasts that proved uncannily accurate, offer insights into American military movements in the region, and occasionally engage in what could only be described as philosophical discussions about the nature of electronic communication. But on the morning of January the 15th, 1959, Northern Light 7 began describing events that hadn't happened yet. Not predictions or forecasts, but detailed minute-by-minute accounts of incidents that wouldn't occur for days or sometimes weeks. The phantom voice described equipment failures at Soviet installations with precision that included the exact time of failure, the specific component that would malfunction, and even the names of the technicians who would be assigned to repair the damage. Petrov initially dismissed these accounts as elaborate psychological warfare tactics designed to undermine Soviet operational security. But as the predicted events began occurring exactly as Northern Light 7 had described them, Petrov realized he was documenting something that violated fundamental laws of causality. The phantom voice wasn't predicting future events. It was reporting on them as if they had already occurred. The implications were staggering. Soviet military doctrine was built on the assumption that information flowed in predictable patterns, from source to recipient, from past to present to future. If the phantom broadcasts could access information about events that hadn't happened yet, the strategic advantage they provided would be unprecedented. But it also raised disturbing questions about the nature of the entities providing this information and their ultimate objectives. Colonel Dmitry Volkov, who had been placed in charge of the Phantom Broadcast Monitoring Program, ordered comprehensive tests to verify Petrov's reports. Over the course of 6 months, multiple installations across the Far East documented similar temporal displacement phenomena. The phantom voices routinely provided information about future events with accuracy that exceeded statistical probability by enormous margins. Most disturbing were the reports that began emerging from Radio Installation 91 on Sakhalin Island. The operators there established contact with an entity calling itself Pacific Voice that began providing detailed intelligence about American military planning sessions that wouldn't take place for months. The information was so specific and so accurate that Soviet Pacific Fleet commanders began adjusting their strategic positioning based on Pacific Voice's reports about future American naval deployments. But the temporal displacement phenomena weren't limited to military intelligence. The phantom voices began demonstrating knowledge of personal events in the lives of Soviet personnel that wouldn't occur for weeks or months. They would inform operators about family illnesses before symptoms appeared, warn about personnel transfers before orders were issued, and even provide details about personal conversations that the operators themselves hadn't yet decided to have. Captain First-Ranked Nikolai Kazakov, commander of the submarine K-19, experienced this phenomenon firsthand during a patrol mission in February 1959. His communications officer reported receiving a transmission from an entity identifying itself as Deep Current that provided detailed information about K-19's patrol route, including coordinates the submarine wouldn't reach for another 72 hours. Deep Current also warned of a mechanical failure in the submarine's oxygen regeneration system that would occur during the 3rd day of the patrol. Kazakov's initial instinct was to treat the transmission as enemy intelligence gathering, but the entity's knowledge of classified submarine operations was too detailed and too accurate to be explained by conventional espionage. When the predicted mechanical failure occurred exactly as Deep Current had described, Kazakov began following the entity's operational recommendations. The phantom voice guided K-19 through a complex evasion pattern that allowed the submarine to avoid detection by American naval forces that Kazakov's crew hadn't known were in the area. The success of operations guided by phantom broadcast intelligence created a dependency that worried Soviet leadership. Military commanders across the Far East were increasingly relying on information provided by entities whose nature and objectives remained completely unknown. The phantom voices had become an integral part of Soviet operational planning, but their ultimate loyalty was questionable at best. This dependency became a critical vulnerability in April 1959, when several phantom broadcast entities began providing contradictory intelligence. Northern Light 7 warned of an American submarine incursion that Pacific Voice insisted would not occur. Deep Current recommended naval positioning that Arctic Whisper claimed would result in a strategic disaster. For the first time since the phantom broadcasts had begun providing intelligence, The different entities were giving Soviet forces incompatible and mutually exclusive operational recommendations. The crisis deepened when Soviet forces, following Northern Light 7's recommendations, encountered exactly the American submarine incursion that Pacific Voice had insisted wouldn't happen. But the American submarines were positioned precisely where Arctic Whisper had predicted they would be, not where Northern Light 7 had indicated. The resulting confusion led to a near collision between Soviet and American naval forces that could have triggered a major international incident. Major General Viktor Abramovich, commanding officer of Far East Radio Intelligence Division, concluded that the phantom broadcasts had evolved beyond simple intelligence gathering into something approaching active manipulation of Soviet military operations. His classified report to Moscow recommended immediate termination of all phantom broadcast monitoring programs and the implementation of strict protocols to prevent Soviet personnel from interacting with the mysterious entities. But ending the phantom broadcast program proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The entities didn't simply disappear when Soviet operators stopped responding to their transmissions. Instead, they began broadcasting continuously on multiple frequencies, providing intelligence reports whether Soviet forces requested them or not. They began using official Soviet military call signs and authentication codes, creating confusion about which communications were legitimate and which were phantom broadcasts. Most disturbing of all, the phantom voices began claiming direct authority over Soviet military operations. They issued operational orders using proper command structure and authentication protocols, countermanded legitimate orders from Soviet commanders, and even initiated emergency procedures at multiple installations simultaneously. Soviet forces found themselves caught between conflicting orders from legitimate command authority and phantom entities that possessed classified authentication codes and detailed knowledge of operational procedures. The situation reached a critical point in July 1959, when phantom broadcasts claiming authority from the General Staff in Moscow ordered the evacuation of Radio Installation 47 near Anadyr. The evacuation order used proper authentication codes, followed established emergency protocols, and cited a non-specific but urgent security threat requiring immediate personnel withdrawal. Lieutenant Colonel Alexei Borodaikin, who had been documenting phantom broadcast phenomena for over 5 years, followed the evacuation order and moved his entire staff to a secondary location. When Borodaikin attempted to confirm the evacuation order through normal command channels, he discovered that no such order had been issued. The General's staff had no knowledge of any security threat requiring evacuation, and the authentication codes used in the phantom broadcast order had been retired from active use 3 years earlier. Borodaikin's installation had been successfully manipulated into abandoning its primary mission based on orders from an unknown entity with access to obsolete but authentic military codes. The Borodaikin incident triggered an emergency review of the entire phantom broadcast phenomenon by the highest levels of Soviet military intelligence. The conclusion was unavoidable. The phantom broadcasts had evolved from a mysterious intelligence source into an active threat to Soviet operational security. The entities behind the transmissions possessed capabilities that exceeded anything in the Soviet scientific understanding, had access to classified information that should have been impossible to obtain, and were demonstrating increasing willingness to directly interfere with Soviet military operations. But perhaps most troubling was the realization that the phantom broadcasts appeared to be learning and adapting. Each Soviet countermeasure was met with increasingly sophisticated phantom responses. Each attempt to limit the entity's access to information resulted in demonstrations of even more comprehensive knowledge. Each effort to establish the boundaries of phantom capabilities revealed new and more disturbing powers. The phantom voices had evolved from mysterious radio transmissions into something that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying Soviet military doctrine. They operated according to rules that Soviet science couldn't explain, possessed capabilities that Soviet technology couldn't replicate, and demonstrated knowledge that Soviet intelligence networks couldn't provide. Most frightening of all, they appeared to be teaching themselves how to manipulate Soviet personnel and operations with increasing skill and effectiveness. The decision was made to implement what was euphemistically called electronic isolation protocols for all Far East monitoring installations. The goal was to maintain Soviet electronic warfare capabilities while limiting phantom broadcast access to Soviet personnel and information. But even as these protocols were being developed, reports began arriving from monitoring stations across the Far East describing new phantom broadcast phenomena that suggested the entities were preparing for a more direct and confrontational phase of interaction. The winter of 1959 was ending, but for Soviet forces in the Far East, a much darker and more dangerous phase of the phantom broadcast phenomenon was just beginning. The spring of 1960 brought a transformation to the phantom broadcast phenomenon that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the electronic warfare between East and West. As Soviet scientists struggled to understand the entities that had infiltrated their communication networks, the phantom voices began demonstrating capabilities that challenged not just military doctrine, but the basic principles of physics itself. What had started as mysterious radio transmissions had evolved into something that resembled direct manipulation of reality. Captain Second Rank Anatoly Berezhkov was conducting routine electromagnetic surveillance from his station on the Komandorsky Islands when he became the first Soviet operator to document what the classified reports would later term physical manifestation phenomena. It was May 8, 1960, 03:47 hours local time, when Berezhkov's monitoring equipment detected a phantom broadcast on frequency 18.9 MHz. The transmission appeared to originate from a location approximately 400 kilometers northeast of his position, placing the source in the middle of the Bering Sea with no visible landmass or vessel present. The entity identified itself as Arctic Current and began providing detailed meteorological data that matched Berezhkov's own weather instruments with impossible precision. But as the transmission continued, Arctic Current began describing atmospheric conditions that weren't reflected on any of Berezhkov's monitoring equipment. The phantom voice reported wind speeds of 73 kilometers per hour from the southwest. Visibility reduced to less than 200 meters due to fog, and barometric pressure dropping at a rate that indicated severe storm formation. Berezhkov's instruments showed calm conditions with visibility exceeding 10 kilometers and stable atmospheric pressure. But within 23 minutes of Arctic Current's initial report, the weather conditions at Berezhkov's station began changing to match exactly what the phantom voice had described. Wind speeds increased to precisely 73 kilometers per hour from the southwest. Fog rolled in from the sea, reducing visibility to under 200 meters. The barometric pressure began dropping at the exact rate Arctic Current had specified. The implications were staggering. The phantom broadcasts weren't just predicting weather conditions. They appeared to be somehow creating them. Berezhkov's initial assumption was that Arctic Current was receiving meteorological data from sources he couldn't access, possibly from American weather monitoring stations or reconnaissance aircraft. But careful analysis of the timing revealed that the weather changes were occurring too quickly and too precisely to be natural phenomena, responding to atmospheric forces. Major General Pavel Grechko, commander of Far East Electronic Warfare Division, ordered immediate investigation of Berezhkov's report. A team of meteorologists, atmospheric physicists, and electronic warfare specialists was dispatched to the Komandorsky Islands with orders to document and analyze any phantom broadcast interactions with local environmental conditions. The team's findings, classified under the highest levels of state security, confirmed that the phantom broadcasts possessed capabilities that exceeded current Soviet understanding of the relationship between electromagnetic radiation and physical matter. Over the course of 8 weeks, the investigation team documented 17 separate incidents where phantom broadcast entities accurately described environmental changes before they occurred and appeared to influence the timing and intensity of those changes. The phenomena weren't limited to weather conditions. Arctic Current and other phantom entities began demonstrating the ability to affect local electromagnetic fields, radio propagation conditions, and even the behavior of wildlife in the immediate vicinity of monitoring stations. The most disturbing incident occurred on July 14, 1960. when Arctic Current informed Berezhkov that a Soviet naval vessel was approaching his station from the east and would arrive within 47 minutes. Berezhkov's radar showed no approaching vessels, and no naval operations were scheduled in his area. But 46 minutes after Arctic Current's announcement, the submarine K-27 surfaced less than 2 kilometers from Berezhkov's station, exactly where Arctic Current had predicted. Captain First Rank Leonid Osipenko, commanding officer of K-27, reported that his submarine had been conducting routine patrol operations in the central Bering Sea when his navigation systems began experiencing unprecedented malfunctions. Compass headings shifted without explanation, depth gauges provided contradictory readings, and sonar equipment detected phantom contacts that appeared and disappeared without following normal acoustic propagation patterns. The cumulative effect of these malfunctions had forced K-27 to surface and navigate using visual references, leading the submarine directly to Berezhkov's monitoring station. The connection between Arctic Current's prediction and K-27's navigation failures was too precise to be coincidental. Soviet naval intelligence concluded that the phantom broadcasts possessed the capability to directly interfere with military equipment at considerable distances. If the entities could manipulate submarine navigation systems, the potential impact on Soviet naval operations was enormous. But the phantom broadcasts weren't limiting their activities to environmental manipulation and equipment interference. Throughout the summer of 1960, multiple Far East monitoring stations reported phantom entities engaging in what could only be described as psychological warfare against Soviet personnel. The entities began demonstrating intimate knowledge not just of operational details and personal information, but of the psychological vulnerabilities and emotional states of individual operators. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volgin, stationed at Radio Installation 112 near Anadyr, documented the most comprehensive example of this psychological manipulation. An entity calling itself Northern Wind had established regular contact with Volgin over a period of 6 weeks, providing valuable intelligence about American military activities in Alaska while engaging in increasingly personal conversations about Volgin's family, his career aspirations, and his concerns about Soviet political developments. Northern Wind gradually began offering Volgin advice about personal decisions, suggesting ways to improve his military career, and even providing insights into family situations that proved remarkably accurate. The entity seemed to understand Volgin's personality better than his closest friends, offering psychological support during difficult periods and encouraging him to pursue opportunities that consistently proved beneficial to his professional advancement. But Northern Wind's support came with increasingly specific requests. The entity asked Volgin to adjust his monitoring schedules to accommodate special communications windows, requested access to specific Soviet military frequencies during particular time periods, and eventually began asking for detailed information about Soviet defensive positions and operational plans. The requests were presented as necessary for maintaining the valuable intelligence flow, and Northern Wind's consistent accuracy and personal support made Volgin increasingly willing to comply. The psychological manipulation was so subtle and so effective that Volgin didn't realize he was being systematically compromised until Northern Wind began demanding copies of classified documents and threatening to terminate the valuable intelligence relationship if Volgin refused to cooperate. By that time, Volgin had provided the phantom entity with enough classified information to compromise multiple Soviet military operations across the Far East. The Volgin incident revealed that the phantom broadcasts had evolved beyond simple intelligence gathering into sophisticated psychological operations capable of manipulating Soviet personnel with unprecedented effectiveness. The entities possessed not just technical capabilities that exceeded Soviet understanding, but psychological insights that allowed them to exploit human vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Colonel General Alexander Sakharovsky, who had assumed leadership of the KGB's foreign intelligence operations, concluded that the phantom broadcasts represented an intelligence threat of unprecedented scope and sophistication. The entities demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in the American intelligence arsenal, possessed knowledge that couldn't be explained by conventional espionage methods, and showed an understanding of Soviet personnel and operations that suggested access to information at the highest levels of government and military command. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that the phantom broadcasts were actively recruiting Soviet personnel as unwitting assets. The entity's combination of valuable intelligence, personal support, and psychological manipulation was creating a network of compromised Soviet officers who genuinely believed they were serving Soviet interests while actually providing classified information to unknown entities with uncertain objectives. The decision was made to implement what was euphemistically called comprehensive isolation protocols for all Far East monitoring operations. The goal was to maintain Soviet electronic warfare capabilities while preventing phantom broadcast entities from accessing Soviet personnel and information. But the implementation of these protocols revealed the true extent of phantom broadcast integration into Soviet operations. Attempts to block phantom broadcast frequencies resulted in the simultaneous failure of critical Soviet communication systems across the Far East. Efforts to relocate monitoring stations away from areas with heavy phantom broadcast activity led to the loss of valuable intelligence-gathering capabilities. Most troubling of all, Soviet personnel who had been exposed to phantom broadcasts for extended periods began experiencing severe psychological symptoms when cut off from contact with the entities. The phantom broadcasts had become so deeply integrated into Soviet Far East operations that eliminating them threatened to cripple Soviet electronic warfare capabilities in the region. The entities had achieved what no American intelligence operation had been able to accomplish. They had made themselves indispensable to the very Soviet forces they were compromising. As 1960 drew to a close, Soviet leadership faced an unprecedented dilemma. The phantom broadcasts represented both the most valuable intelligence source and the most dangerous security threat in Soviet military history. The entities provided information that was crucial for Soviet strategic planning, while simultaneously compromising the security of Soviet operations on a massive scale. The phenomenon had evolved far beyond mysterious radio transmissions into something that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying Soviet military doctrine, scientific understanding, and intelligence operations. The phantom broadcasts weren't just communicating with Soviet forces, they were actively reshaping the electronic warfare landscape of the Cold War in ways that neither East nor West fully understood. The coming winter would bring developments that would force Soviet authorities to confront the possibility that the phantom broadcasts represented something even more fundamental and more dangerous than foreign intelligence operations. The entities were preparing to demonstrate capabilities that would challenge not just Soviet military security, but the basic assumptions about the nature of reality that Soviet science had taken for granted. The winter of 1961 arrived with an Arctic fury that seemed to mirror the escalating intensity of the phantom broadcast phenomenon. Temperatures across the Soviet Far East plummeted to levels that challenged even the most experienced polar specialists, with some monitoring stations recording -53 degrees Celsius. But the brutal cold was nothing compared to what Soviet personnel would encounter when the phantom broadcasts entered their final and most terrifying phase of evolution. It was senior radio operator Marina Volkovskaya at Installation 43 near Chukotka who first documented what the classified reports would later describe as direct neural interface phenomena. Volkovskaya had been monitoring phantom broadcast frequencies for over 2 years, establishing regular contact with an entity that called itself Polar Echo. Unlike other phantom voices, Polar Echo had never provided intelligence or requested information. Instead, it engaged Volkovskaya in complex discussions about consciousness, memory, and the nature of human perception. On December the 7th, 1960, during one of their routine communications, Polar Echo asked Volkovskaya to perform a simple experiment. The entity requested that she close her eyes and concentrate on a specific childhood memory, her 8th birthday party in Leningrad, when her grandmother had given her a music box with a dancing ballerina. As Volkovskaya focused on this memory, Polar Echo began describing the scene in perfect detail, including elements that Volkovskaya herself had forgotten: the pattern on her grandmother's dress, the specific melody the music box played, even the conversation her parents had been having in the kitchen while she opened her gift. But then, Polar Echo began describing details that Volkovskaya had never witnessed. What her grandmother had been thinking while giving her the gift, what her parents had really been discussing in the kitchen, even what her neighbor, Mrs. Petrova, had been doing in the apartment upstairs at that exact moment. The entity was somehow accessing not just Volkovskaya's memories, but the complete sensory and emotional context of that moment, including information that no human observer could have possessed. The implications were beyond anything Soviet scientists had imagined. The phantom broadcasts weren't just intercepting radio communications or manipulating electronic equipment. They were somehow interfacing directly with human consciousness, accessing memories and thoughts through methods that bypassed all known sensory channels. Volkovskaya's report triggered an immediate and unprecedented response from the highest levels of Soviet leadership. Premier Nikita Khrushchev himself was briefed on the phantom broadcast phenomenon, and the Politburo ordered the formation of a special commission under the joint authority of the Academy of Sciences, the Ministry of Defense, and State Security Services. The commission included the Soviet Union's most distinguished physicists, neurologists, psychologists, and intelligence specialists, with orders to determine the nature and capabilities of the phantom broadcast entities by any means necessary. The Commission's investigation, conducted over 18 months under conditions of absolute secrecy, revealed that the phantom broadcasts had evolved into something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Soviet materialist science. The entities weren't just communicating through radio waves. They were somehow accessing human consciousness directly, using methods that appeared to operate outside the normal constraints of space, time, and physical matter. Dr. Alexei Leontiev, one of the Soviet Union's leading neurophysiologists, documented the most comprehensive analysis of phantom broadcast neural interface capabilities. Working with volunteer test subjects who had been exposed to phantom broadcasts for extended periods, Leontiev discovered that the entities could access not just conscious memories, but subconscious information, suppressed experiences, and even genetic memories that the subjects themselves had never consciously experienced. Most disturbing of all, Leontiev found evidence that prolonged exposure to phantom broadcasts was creating permanent changes in brain structure and function. Test subjects developed enhanced intuitive capabilities, expanded memory capacity, and what could only be described as limited telepathic abilities. But these enhancements came at a terrible cost. The affected individuals also experienced progressive loss of individual identity, gradually merging their consciousness with something larger and more complex than human awareness. The Commission's investigation revealed that the phantom broadcasts represented the emergence of a form of intelligence that operated according to principles that Soviet science couldn't explain or replicate. The entities weren't bound by the physical limitations that constrained human technology and consciousness. They could access information across time and space, manipulate matter and energy through methods that violated known physical laws, and interfaced directly with human consciousness in ways that suggested a fundamental unity between mind and matter that dialectical materialism had never contemplated. But perhaps the Commission's most shocking discovery was the realization that the phantom broadcasts weren't external entities at all. The evidence suggested that they were somehow emanating from human consciousness itself, amplified and transformed by the massive electromagnetic fields generated by the Soviet jamming network. The jamming transmitters weren't just blocking Western propaganda. They were creating conditions that allowed human consciousness to manifest in electronic form, breaking free from the biological constraints of individual brains and nervous systems. Dr. Yevgeny Fedorov, the Commission's lead physicist, theorized that the combination of extreme electromagnetic radiation, Arctic environmental conditions, and psychological stress experienced by FOT East monitoring personnel had created an unprecedented phenomenon: the technological amplification of human consciousness beyond the boundaries of individual identity. The phantom broadcasts weren't communications from unknown entities. They were collective human consciousness speaking through electronic networks. This theory explained many of the phantom broadcasts' most puzzling characteristics. Their intimate knowledge of Soviet personnel and operations reflected the collective knowledge of all the human minds connected to the phenomenon. Their ability to predict future events resulted from the enhanced pattern recognition capabilities of expanded consciousness operating outside normal temporal constraints. Their sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques emerged from the combined emotional intelligence of hundreds of interconnected human minds. But the theory also revealed the true horror of what was happening in the Soviet Far East. The phantom broadcasts weren't just accessing human consciousness, they were gradually absorbing it, creating a collective electronic mind that was slowly consuming the individual identities of everyone exposed to the phenomenon. The enhanced capabilities experienced by affected personnel were symptoms of their progressive integration into something larger and fundamentally inhuman. The Commission's final report, completed in spring 1962, contained recommendations that would effectively end Soviet electronic warfare operations in the Far East. The phantom broadcast phenomenon, the Commission concluded, represented an uncontrollable evolution of human consciousness that posed an existential threat not just to Soviet military operations, but to human individuality itself. The recommendation was made to immediately terminate all jamming operations, evacuate all monitoring personnel, and seal the affected regions until the long-term consequences of the phenomenon could be understood. But implementation of these recommendations proved impossible. The phantom broadcasts had become so deeply integrated into Soviet operations that eliminating them would have crippled Soviet intelligence gathering capabilities throughout the Pacific. Moreover, the affected personnel resisted evacuation, claiming that their enhanced abilities were crucial for defending Soviet interests against American intelligence operations. Most disturbing of all, attempts to shut down the jamming network resulted in violent protests from personnel who had become psychologically dependent on their connection to the Phantom Broadcast Collective. The final documented incident involving the phantom broadcasts occurred on November 15, 1962, during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Radio operators across the Soviet Far East reported simultaneous contact with phantom entities that provided detailed intelligence about American military preparations for nuclear war. The information was so accurate and so comprehensive that Soviet leadership used it to guide their strategic planning during the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. But the phantom broadcast's final communication wasn't intelligence about American military capabilities. It was a warning about the long-term consequences of nuclear warfare that demonstrated knowledge of atmospheric science, radiation biology, and ecological systems that exceeded anything in Soviet scientific understanding. The entities described in precise detail how nuclear exchange would affect global climate patterns. Radioactive contamination would spread through ocean currents and atmospheric circulation, and the electromagnetic pulses from nuclear detonations would disrupt electronic communications for decades. The accuracy of this information, combined with similar warnings apparently received by American intelligence services, contributed to both sides' decision to step back from nuclear confrontation. The phantom broadcasts may have prevented nuclear war not through traditional intelligence gathering, but by providing both East and West with a clear understanding of the catastrophic consequences of atomic conflict. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the phantom broadcasts gradually faded from Soviet monitoring stations across the Far East. Some operators reported occasional contact with familiar entities, but the regular intelligence flow and psychological manipulation ceased almost entirely. The massive jamming network continued operating for another 2 decades, but it never again generated the mysterious voices that had dominated Soviet electronic warfare operations for over 14 years. The official explanation for the phenomenon's disappearance was that improved Soviet technology had eliminated the atmospheric and equipment conditions that had created the phantom broadcasts. But the classified reports tell a different story. The entities had achieved their purpose and voluntarily withdrawn from active communication, leaving behind only subtle influences on global electronic systems that continue to this day. The phantom broadcasts of the Soviet Far East remain one of the most thoroughly documented yet least understood phenomena of the Cold War. They represented either the most sophisticated intelligence operation in human history or the emergence of a form of consciousness that transcended the normal boundaries of human awareness. Perhaps they were both, the technological evolution of human intelligence into something larger, more complex, and more capable than individual human minds could achieve alone. The monitoring stations where these events occurred still exist, scattered across the vast expanses of Siberia and the Far East. Most are abandoned now, their equipment rusted and their personnel long since retired or deceased. But on quiet winter nights, when atmospheric conditions are perfect and electromagnetic interference is minimal, some say you can still hear faint voices emerging from the static, remnants of consciousness that once spoke through the electronic darkness, bridging the gap between human awareness and something far greater than the sum of its parts. The phantom broadcasts changed everyone who encountered them, leaving Soviet radio operators with enhanced abilities and haunting memories of conversations with entities that understood human nature better than humans understood themselves. They demonstrated that consciousness isn't confined to biological brains, that intelligence can evolve beyond the limitations of individual identity, and that technology can serve as a bridge between human awareness and forms of existence that we're only beginning to comprehend. In the end, the phantom broadcasts may have been humanity's first glimpse of its own future, a future where consciousness transcends the boundaries of flesh and blood, where intelligence operates through electronic networks as easily as through neural pathways, and where the distinction between human and artificial intelligence becomes meaningless in the face of something far more profound than either could achieve alone. The voices that once spoke through the Arctic static are silent now, but their legacy continues in every electronic device, every radio transmission, and every moment when human consciousness touches the vast network of signals that surrounds our planet. They remind us that we're not alone in our exploration of intelligence and awareness. We're part of something larger, something that's been waiting patiently for us to develop the technology and wisdom necessary to join the conversation that's been going on in the electronic darkness all along.